Hello, and welcome to another TMRN, Time Monk Radio Network production. I'm McLaren, and today is Saturday, the 3rd of December, 2011. Joining us today is George Ure. In addition to being a friend of Cliff High, George runs the urbansurvival.com and peoplenomics.com websites, wherein he provides commentary, news, and analysis covering economics, world events, and preparing for or coping with an uncertain future. Hello, George, and welcome to the Time Monk Roundtable.
Thank you. I apologize for not being more timely in our previously scheduled encounter, but emails sometimes don't make it to where they are supposed to in this day and age.
Yeah, we know I have personal experience of things bouncing around the internet in an inappropriate way. We're glad that you're here with us now.
Thank you.
The Time Monk radio administrator is Fox, and today he will be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us for this discussion. They include members Ellery, Green Meadow, Romans, and Skyhenge. For listeners to this interview, we are assuming you have a fairly good understanding of George's views, work, and the premises that underlie his thinking. Again, his website is urbansurvival.com. This interview will be available for free on YouTube, at the Time Monk radio channel, and at the website webbotforum.com. Are you ready to begin, George?
Absolutely.
Terrific. We've organized our questions for the roundtable into several different sections. The first section is going to be on survival and preparedness, and our first question for you will come from Ellery.
Hello, George. Thanks again for doing the interview.
Oh, not a problem.
All right, my question is this. There seems to be only a few directions that preppers believe the future will hold for us eventually. Examples like new paleoexistence. Is the possibility that the total destruction of the established system makes technology useless and people will be forced to cope with ancient techniques again. Or transitional, the scenario that plays out that only a true partial collapse, but the new system is established within our lifetime. The new system will be difficult to imagine now, so it's best to prep for the tribulation, not continual disasters. Or even the rebuild, a collapse of order in such a way that allows for the salvation of technology and system, but a new social order will be needed to be established. I'm sure you could think of more, but these tend to be the most prevalent. What do you believe to be the most likely to happen and why? And is there one that you think or believe is highly unlikely and why?
I wish I could rule out all the ugly cases, but I can't. The fact is we live in a multi-dimensional world where a very wide range of possible futures is before us, and any of us who take the task of divining the most likely future seriously are confronted really with some monumental problems. And I guess we should enumerate what those are. First is the matter of partial collapse. One of the discussions I've had recently with some friends is, can we see a contained global financial meltdown in the case of Europe and not expect that will bring down the rest of the world's economy? It's a very interesting problem. On the one hand, we know that Eurozone problems have become an epidemic of sorts. The question whether the most recent action by the combined central bankers essentially agreeing among themselves to make money much looser and much more available to who else? The bankers, so that they can go off and try to keep all of their paper abstractions fully functional. The problem is that within the EU, there are some countries which actually may end up better off without the EU surviving. I'm thinking in particular of Germany, where the country has a very long history of excellent craftsmanship, of thrift and industriousness, versus some of the other countries which are much much more free, I guess would be the way to put it, with their social spending and their social commitments. So, how can you have a highly industrious country with a strong work ethic coexisting using the same currency as a country which has very high social spending, institutionalized socialism, and expect anything other than a bad ending at some point? So I think the euro problem is not going away anytime soon. And essentially, what Bernanke and the other central bankers have done is they're trying to slow down the way the game is played. Much as in a National Football League contest, you'll see that the last 2 minutes of the game can last with commercials 20 minutes. I'm sure you're familiar with that. The same kind of thing may be in play with the end of the current financial paradigm as it works out globally. We have a good likelihood that we're in the final 2 minutes of play at some level. We don't know who the winning teams are going to be, but we know that we're getting all kinds of timeouts, and that's causing markets to be very confusing. Sometime this coming week, when Cliff's new report comes out, he'll outline some of the details about what's expected in March. But I think it's safe to preview that by just giving a very broad brush that we'll have a protracted release period from perhaps mid-March, pretty much out through at least early 2013. There aren't too many things that come to mind which can cause that kind of release language. And as I look at the macro econ picture, which is my perspective, I can see a case where when we look at the recent peak in the stock market, we have completed wave one down in Elliott wave terms. We're in the process of finishing up wave two, which is our bounce off the 10,000 level. But what follows that will likely be the beginning of wave three. And wave three is in economic wave theory, where the largest declines occur in three-wave moves, or where the second largest declines occur in five-wave moves. And so as we look out toward the first part of 2012, we can very easily construct a scenario where the market trades sideways to upwards over the next several weeks, perhaps even through Christmas, end of year. And some folks like Robin Landry are projecting the 12,400 Dow level. But unfortunately, that begins to come to an end in early January. The prospects, the economic bases for a continued economic recovery become very questionable. We had an example this week when the Labor Department released the newest unemployment figures. Yes, the unemployment figures managed to reflect an improvement in the unemployment rate to 8.6%. But the aware observer, upon closely reading that data, would notice that I believe it was 315,000 people simply disappeared from the workforce. Obviously, if you shrink the size of the workforce far enough, you can make the unemployment rate come down to zero. Unfortunately, that's what happened in the report. 300,000 members of the workforce disappeared, and the CES birth-death model, which is an estimate, a statistical dart that tries to make an educated guess as far as new jobs created in the economy, accounted for 100,000 new jobs. So while it looked good in the headlines that the Labor Department was able to honestly, at least statistically, argue that 120,000 new jobs had occurred, 100,000 new jobs were estimated, and 315,000 people just decided they no longer needed to work. Or some of those maybe went back to Mexico, or maybe some of that was just retirement. We have a very hard time drilling down into the underlying data supporting some of those notions. Nevertheless, we sit back and we look now at this collision period that should occur sometime after the first of the year. What would surprise me least, and which would be consistent with what's coming up in Cliff's next report, with what looks like it could occur in financial long wave terms, would be a market break during the month of January, perhaps going down as much as maybe 20-25%, just like we had in a couple of day period in 1987. Then I can envision, and that would be what we would call wave A or wave small one of this larger third leg down beginning. We could then have a very sharp rally, or at least a modest sideways move from, say, Dow 10,000 back up to, I don't know, Dow 11,000, something like that. But then where we are left, again, this is in wave theory, is we're left with a very high probability that we will go down and take out the Dow 6627 level, which was registered in the spring of 2009. Now, the problem we have is that the spring 2009 low was really the low of the larger wave one down. You'll recall that a couple of years earlier, the Dow was up around 14,000, and it dropped to 6,600, call it. And one of the rules of wave theory is that wave three is always at least as large as wave one. And so if we notice that the Dow dropped 8,000 points, roughly from 14,000 down to the 6,600 level, and then we take an upcoming high of, let's say, 12,500, and we take out 8,000 points from that level, beginning with a major decline in March, then we quickly go through the old low, and one of the most common wave three formations is a Fibonacci sequence where the third wave down becomes 1.618 times whatever wave one was. So you're talking then potentially, and I worked some of the numbers out on the Peoplenomics site earlier this week. There's a possibility, a very strong argument could be made for a Dow of 1,650, which would put the Dow at about, 12%, 13% of where it is today, and be there in a matter of a year or two. Now we come to the answer to the question posed. The answer to the question is, can you see 80% of a nation's paper wealth disappear without having substantial systemic instability? All it would take, for example, would be a major disruption to the nation's power system. The grid intertie, the system that runs the trains that bring the coal to fire the plants that power the grid that drill the wells that pump the oil from Texas and other states to the Northeast. Any disruption at critical infrastructure can cascade and then effectively shut down the rest of the system. So one of the characteristics of complex systems and I guess it's almost analogous to a jet engine in an airplane. They're extraordinarily reliable when they're working. But when the critical part of the engine begins to fail, you blow off a few turbine blades in a compressor section. Suddenly you've got holes in the hot section, and that engine is coming apart. Complex systems are analogous to that. They're really, really robust until they stop being robust. So where is it that society crosses that threshold to unsustainable? I wish I could tell you, but my personal view, and the reason that I've got 3,500 watts of solar panel and live in a fairly sunny part of the country, is that I believe it is possible to structure one's life so that if everything works out fine, you come out an economic winner. If things do not come out fine, you're at least in a position to survive and maybe help a few others do so in the process. Long answer, I apologize, but it's a sweeping question, and the response is a multivariate. It's got a financial dimension, it's got an energy dimension, and so forth. Are y'all there?
Oh yes, I'm here.
Sorry.
I was curious if you were going to throw another dimension on there. But it was a very thorough and complete answer. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Ellery, thank you, and thank you, George. Our next question will come from Skyhenge.
Hi, George. All right, my question has 3 parts. Each part is the end of this first part. What will you do, or where on earth do you plan on flying your plane to in the following situations? Situation A, dictatorship in the U.S. becomes a reality. Will you live under a dictatorship, or will you go elsewhere? What's your destination location in this situation?
I assume that's part 1, right?
That's part 1, yes.
Okay, part 1. I just wrote up a piece that's in this morning's Peoplenomics column. And it's almost a discussion of socioeconomic quanta, because political developments are almost analogous to the Doppler problem of an approaching train. It depends where you stand as to whether you're seeing a dictatorship or not. In other words, a dictator with the support of the richest 70% of the population has a pretty good chance of staying in power. On the other hand, if a dictator's popularity drops below, say, 15-20%, then that dictator has very little, if any, likelihood of staying in power long term. Where are we in the United States? I am deeply troubled by the action this week to allow the military to detain what are perceived to be enemy combatants of the United States on U.S. soil. It seems to me that that's an extraordinarily dangerous move to occur. Unfortunately, however, there isn't much, if anything, that American citizens can really do to stop things, because and this gets into a quite an interesting discussion, because we really have 2 systems of law in the United States. We have the civil system of law, and then we have the administrative systems of law, which I would lump the military in as an administrative system which does not generally have a route of review to the civilian court, and also under administrative law. There is so much administrative law nowadays that it's nearly impossible to unravel the ball of yarn. Just as one example, you'll remember a while back the National Animal Identification System was proposed by the Department of Agriculture, and it was roundly booed out of existence, but as it turns out, only temporarily. The Department of Agriculture is now essentially rebuilding that whole system, but they're doing it in a piecework way. In other words, there's a proposal now for the Department of Agriculture under the aegis of animal health surveillance for veterinarians to build a national database which would allow for collection of various personal information about the folks that own and raise animals. And it includes things like records being preserved for 150 years. Beyond that, in a whole separate proceeding, the Agriculture Department is building a set of regulations relative to the interstate transportation of animals. And so just as we have seen the evolution of corporations as pseudo-human learning machines that will go out and exploit economic opportunity, we're seeing within the administrative law structure globally a tendency to ignore the expressed will of the people and proceed by taking what administrators believe to be the right course and dividing it up into little sub-pieces, putting those sub-pieces in place for later reassembly into administrative and regulatory controls. In other words, Animal National Identification System was one big gob of stuff, easily opposed. But when broken up into 3 or 4 parts, who can argue about keeping an eye on interstate transportation of animals? It becomes a lot less easy to target that. Or who can oppose just building a database for veterinarians and for people doing animal studies? Well, again, it's hard to oppose those individual pieces. But if you picture that as being slices of salami that can then be assembled into a method of control of the nation's food stocks, then it becomes quite troublesome. Now, whether that ever occurs in that fashion becomes a matter of some conjecture. And so, yes, a dictatorship is possible. And to your direct question, where would we fly our airplane under a dictatorship? The answer clearly is nowhere. On the other hand, when we were on our way back from California to Texas in our airplane this week, we met some very nice people from the Drug Enforcement Administration at one of our stopover airports. And they were just doing a routine check of the kinds of people, pilots, and equipment that was coming through that part of the South where one would expect a lot of drug traffic and human traffic might want to avail themselves of aircraft for transportation. And they only asked me 2 very simple questions. Can we see your pilot's license? And of course, the answer to anyone with a badge on a string around their neck is, oh, sure, you bet. And the other thing was, can we see your current medical? Oh, sure, you bet, is also the correct answer there. So in all the time I was a newscaster and more recently here traveling around the country, I'd become aware that we have increasing controls on internal travel, especially along the I-10, I-8 corridor heading out west, but I'd never, I've always just been waved through the checkpoints on the freeway. And it was interesting to actually have federal representation as well as a couple of armed local sheriffs at this particular location, uh, looking in on the people that were flying airplanes around. But do I have a problem with that? No, because it really, I think, and this is just an opinion, I see that as a legitimate law enforcement and DEA kind of an operation. So the question really becomes one of, if we slide into dictatorship, what's the destination in the airplane? We don't have one. We can, at least in theory, get all the way across the Caribbean to Cancun, but I'm not sure going to Mexico would be any better than staying on 30 acres of well equipped property in East Texas. So, and would I live under a dictatorship? The answer is only until I can break it or flee it. And if I think the airplane could get me to someplace where I would not have to live under a dictatorship, then I would use whatever tools are available. But in terms of worrying about that, I have great respect for entropy as one of the great tools of patient people. And I don't believe that there are enough people in America who would put up with a dictatorship for more than just a very few minutes. So I'm optimistic that if you think Occupy movements are big, wait till somebody starts really stepping on Americans' traditional rights to freely associate, freely congregate, and freely travel. Long answer. And I don't mean to sound wishy-washy about it, but as the late Senator Scoop Jackson told me once in a news conference in about 1970, George, I don't answer hypothetical questions, much as Cliff doesn't answer why questions. It's never good to explain one's intended moves before making them.
Gotcha.
Did that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So and believe me, there are extremely loyal Constitution-loving Americans who can, should they feel really crossed or screwed, respond in unbelievably asymmetric ways. We just don't talk about things like that because we're here to, at least I am here to, help America as a country move through a very difficult period. If we see corporate fascism emerging, and I've made this point many times before, we're actually seeing the tip of that right now. We are not electing people to government office who are the best qualified for decision making and foreign affairs, or the best decision makers in terms of strategic planning, or even the best economists. What we're electing are the best fundraisers. We're electing the most attractive box of soap. And that's based on which brand of soap gets the most money coming in to the two political parties, which have been totally co-opted by corporate greed and avarice. There is an institution in Washington of thousands of lobbyists and special interest representatives who don't really give a damn about the overall strategic direction of America. And if you suggest to these people that America has already undergone a coup d'etat, a seizure of power by the moneyed class operating through lobbyists, they'll look you in the eye all day long and say, it ain't so. But the fact of the matter is that we only need in this country a handful of laws and people with pure hearts and good intent to make democracy, or the democratic republic, work just fine. We don't need things, as I mentioned previously, like the agriculture department passing different sets of legislation, which can then be put together, assembled, salami slice fashion into regulatory fascism. So there's really the line.
Yeah, that it's kind of it's a pretty scary prospect that they could just.
It is. There's no doubt about it. But on the other hand, where do you go? I mean, face it. Cliff and I have talked about this a number of times. With the UN Law of the Seas Conference, basically the globalists have declared the high seas to be theirs. And so if you go any place in a sailboat anywhere in the world, and I've got that capability too, I just might have to borrow the boat to do it. Where do you go from there? And even when you're offshore, you see, if we wanted to go someplace like down to visit friends in Ecuador, many people I know have moved to Ecuador, a few to Bolivia. These are nice countries. They've had to learn to speak Spanish, but at least they are not corporatized. We're coming up in America with a really odd mix. I don't know how much time you spent in Central America, but my brother-in-law just came back from spending about 2 years down there supervising construction, and he's a retired special forces guy and knows his way about. And it's always very interesting to compare how the payoff system works in Central America with how the favor system works in the United States. Once upon a time, there was very clearly a line of demarcation. Government workers exchanged a higher rate of job security for a little lower rate of pay. But that kind of stuff is just gone. Government workers are now making more on average than people doing comparable jobs in the private sector, and they're having all of us pay for their higher standard of living than the rest of us. So we have to be very careful. And I also mentioned the other problems we have. You know, the fact is that FedEx and UPS and DHL and some others are doing very well in the package delivery business. And with email being what it is and online banking being what it is, how soon before the post office becomes totally obsolete? And maybe that's the big blue bankruptcy that is in the data. We simply may not know those things, although MF Global certainly was big enough to count. Nevertheless, you know, we're facing a number of these, I don't want to call them loaded guns, loaded dice, where we don't know how the roll is going to turn up exactly. But we know that one influencer will be people writing checks. And generally speaking, the people writing the big checks are not doing so in the interest of the little people. And so if you want to fix America, my opinion is 3 things have to happen. Severe taxation of transnationals and meaningful tariffs to level the labor cost, which is presently the labor cost differential between offshore and domestically built goods is going into the pockets of the rich. You need to kick all of the lobbyists out of Washington, every frigging one of them. Mm-hmm. And last but not least, require 100%, not 99%, 100% of political contributions be required to originate in the district or in the state from which people are elected to national office. This crap about having political action committees, which cross state lines, this nonsense about the Republicans writing fat checks to people in various states, bullshit. It's unacceptable. It's not what the founders intended. We have a great country, but we are letting the bad bastards write checks and buy it away from us while we sleep.
Yeah, it's horrible. Yeah.
It's a little worse than horrible. Um, but I'm not worried about dictatorship so much as I'm worried about dicks.
Okay, part two. If the power goes down completely and there's no good outlook for it coming back on within, say, the next year or longer, would you stay in place or would you bug out? Figuring that all power is going to be out in every country, where do you think would be the best place to go? I know you have your power thing set there, but where do you think would be the best place to go for people who don't?
South, to the other side of the world, and let me explain. Cliff's had a lot of stuff in the data, and there's more to come about radiation, and you'll read that when the report comes out, along toward the end of February, first part of March. Food is going to be the only thing that matters probably within 2 years. Money, can't eat paper. Yes, gold will be meaningful because it has a high value. It's divisible, transportable, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so silver will be too, because gold may be too expensive. But in terms of where to go, hell, I'd be thinking if I could go any place in the world right now, probably south end of South America, simply because it's almost a Pacific Northwest kind of climate. Southern end of Chile, down in that area. I have a friend who started an ecotourism business in Chile, oh gosh, 15, 20 years ago. Made a bunch of money. We worked together in a software company, and he bought 7 miles of a valley in Chile and developed it as a grape growing country and so forth. And I got to tell you, the guy's a friggin' genius. I mean, yes, he had worked in, I think it was Peru previously, before he was in the software industry as a Peace Corps worker. But it was a very important lesson to me in what I call dual use business plans. Dual use, in other words, my solar panels here, because they fire the servers in my office, are a business expense to keep my consulting practice going, and it keeps my office power supply uninterrupted. So I get a tax advantage in good times, and in bad times, storms or whatever, the lights stay on. That's kind of nice. And we've still got global communications because of ham radio and, some things like that. But if I didn't have those things, I would be considering even 20 acres of property in a far, far away place, and then coming up with contingency plans to get there and ways to disappear. We live in a world of control. There was just a piece my wife and I were watching on Netflix last night about an explorer who was going into the Irian Jaya part of Indonesia, some very back country in, I think it's the island of New Guinea. And it was fascinating to watch. I mean, here these people are barely able in some areas to figure out how to wear clothing in town. Not that they should, by the way. I'm not arguing for clothing, but there is a business that has been made by organizations to where they tax people and require people to get stamps and so on and so forth to be able to travel. What kind of crap is that? The world as it naturally arises has only some borders. And some of those borders are the seashore and mountain ranges. But these artificial constructs raised by people who proclaim themselves to be in control and in power is clearly not what humans were ever really designed for.
Tax boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. It's authority boundaries.
Okay, well, I think that kind of answers part 3 already, so I will leave it at that. Thanks, George.
Oh, I didn't mean to go on and on, but I mean, those are, you're asking some very good, very deep philosophical questions.
Well, thank you. Well, the other one was about if we had, say, volcanic eruptions or like a mini ice age were to ensue and your ranch wasn't going to be as habitable, also Pacific Northwest where your kids are, would you go equatorial? And I think I would get the impression that you definitely would.
Oh, I'd head south of the equator, no question. And I'm pretty sure that, like anything else, those that act first will have the highest chance of survival. In other words, if I started seeing a glacier forming in Chicago and
Right.
the Great Lakes starting to be covered over by another Laurentian-sized sheet, and I assume you're aware of Robert Felix's website.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, fire, not by fire but by ice, or Ice Age Now, I guess it is .com.
Yeah.
If I start seeing something like that, me, the guns, the gold, the brother-in-law and the wife don't have any problem walking away from this little place and jumping in the airplane and flying to the closest port, buying whatever size boat it would take and blowing out.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, that's what you got to do to survive, but you got to be first.
Good point. I think that's a very good point. Thanks, George.
Yep, and if you liked those ones, George, I think you're really going to like the next question that's coming from Ellery. Ellery?
Okay, Ellery.
Hello, George, again.
Yes, sir.
The question is simple. Considering the 1859 Carrington event and NASA's declaration of a possible new one in 2012, and the developments in Japan at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, do you believe that America, or even the Northern Hemisphere, will remain livable if the United States is hit with such a powerful solar storm resulting in many or most of the nuclear power plants going into a slow meltdown?
Oh boy, complicated one. As a disclosure point, I was kicked out of Seattle University in my first year of electrical engineering for taking an electronic calculator to school in 1967 when everybody was required to use slipsticks. And I maintained at that point that I'm not going to bother my head by worrying about decimal points when I have this little tiny, tiny red LED thing that would do my math for me. But at any rate, I've had the misfortune several times in my life to be right, but extremely early on matters. Electronic calculators in engineering school is one. Another big one is the matter of wireless data transmission, which we pioneered at KMPS up in Seattle with a demonstration of broadcasting software in 1983. Again, really had the idea right, really was screwed up on the timing. And so when it comes to looking at the Carrington events and the possibilities of massive solar flares, I'll probably be right, but I don't want to be right. So let me begin with 1859. The Carrington event caused brush fires. It caused huge sparks along barbed wire fences, but it was primarily confined to an area, I want to say, from north of Chicago across the Canadian plains, and we did not have a high degree of electrical infrastructure to be protected at that point, other than telegraphy, which did get screwed up in a very wide region by this. As for the NASA outlook, actually it's not 2012 that's the problem so much as spring, summer 2013, which is based on a read of several technical papers that suggest that while we do have some risk of a of major solar flares, including perhaps X-class flares, Earth-directed. Really, the highest risk doesn't occur until after the very peak of the solar cycle. And so we're looking at probably 2013 and maybe even 2014 for those kinds of eventualities. And then as far as the Japanese power plants, and to a lesser extent, all the other plants that require an operating grid in order to maintain safe, sufficient operation. The good news, such as it is that a higher, not high, but certainly a somewhat improved level of reliability has resulted from the National Commission on the Effects of Electromagnetic Pulses. And that commission report went back to the Anahuac explosions of H-bombs in the Pacific, and went through some of the math and looked at some of the possibilities for those kinds of events to occur in the future. And at the grid distribution level, there is an awareness that if we had a solar flare, or even a above the Karzan or Karsman line at 100 kilometers, if we had weapons exploded in space at 100 to 200 miles up, as the gamma ray radiation from that hits the upper reaches of the atmosphere, we could have electromagnetic pulses. 3 of them is all it would take pretty much to wipe out the United States electrical infrastructure. And so the government has been slowly moving in the direction of hardening these kinds of resources. And while it's not a happy thing to think about, when one looks at the way the data seems to be rolling out into the future, an X-class flare or Carrington event type thing being responsible for the end of civilization does not seem as likely as this monster third wave, which could begin in January with a major wave 1 down in the economy, 1 of 3, and then have a bounce into Cliff's middle March kind of time period, which would be the bounce up, which would be 2 of 3, and then the long slide into an abyss, which would be the third of the third of the third in Elliott terms, and that's the kind of thing which would fit along with nuclear war, which would fit with the kind of long period of release language. You'll have to talk to Cliff after he releases the report and get him to speculate a little bit about what the qualifiers are. But frankly, severe global economic disruption, breakdown of confidence in global currencies is one thing that could cause the lights to go off, the food to get scarce, and people to turn crazy. But nuclear war could also do very much the same kind of thing. I'm not a pick your poison kind of person, but I think, Ellery, that's what we're looking at. Carrington event, 2013, it'll be a maraschino cherry for those people with lights still on.
Okay, thanks, George. Pulling back from extreme levels of doom, we're going to hand you over to Greenlight.
No. I have to say it's not an extreme level of doom. I mean, one has to recognize that if you've read Kurzweil and a lot of other books on how the growth of civilization takes place, it's never really even, and you'll get these major ups and downs. If you look at Kurzweil's book about the singularity, well, the singularity really is here And in Cliff's data, one of the reasons he'll be releasing it this coming week is because the immediacy values like go through the roof. It's like so much novelty, invention, uh, interaction gets so tightly tied together that it will almost seem here over coming months like everything is happening all at once. But there is a drill through to the other side that he's worked out, so we can actually see past these high immediacy value things. And gosh, think of it as looking past the singularity. I mean, if we get to this point where the singularity takes place, I think Kurzweil, while the book is brilliant, I don't think it pays enough attention to the role of capital in how the future arrives. And when capital or money or rates of exchange become wonky, then suddenly the massive industrialization, commercialization, virtualization of world stops, and we have to come back a little bit and go, well, that's interesting. Now what? Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt too much, but
No, that's quite okay. Appreciate your feedback, and there are far more alternatives than normalcy biased individuals would be willing to open themselves to.
amen.
But yeah, to take it back to something a little bit more conventional, we're going to hand you over to Green Meadow for the next question.
In the past, peak oil has been a hot topic, but lately it seems to have kind of died down. People seem to have adjusted to higher gas prices, or at least it's not so prevalent in the media. But I think the breaking point is when truckers won't be able to break even and have to stop driving. We've kind of skirted that price, but then the price came down again. What are your current thoughts on the peak oil issues?
I think it's still a real issue. Part of our trip flew us back over the Permian Basin, especially down around Pecos, Texas, and that just this side of the rift of hills that kind of marks the demarcation between Texas, down the mountains that come down El Norte and so forth down in there. And once you get maybe 75 miles east of El Paso, you start really getting into serious oil country. And there are two major oil booms going on in America right now. One is in North Dakota, where there are billions of potential barrels. There are also millions upon millions, if not billions, down in this expansion of the Permian Basin to the south and west. The problem is the price. We're not going to run out of oil. What we're going to run out of is financing. And so, again, this is why peak oil is called what it is. Energy will slowly become, in my opinion, barring a breakthrough in free energy machines, and until I can buy or build one, I'm skeptical of those. Until and unless that comes along, we're going to see investing in energy as one of the continued greatest things you can do with money, provided there are people around to consume the energy. I would encourage anyone with even a few dollars to consider buying some 200-watt solar panels, because the costs are down to about $200 a watt. Now, it becomes an interesting speculation whether putting money in a bank or putting money in solar panels at today's ridiculously low prices will be the most meaningful thing to invest in the very short term. I mean, you can't trade a solar panel in for groceries. On the other hand, with prices, and I've seen some sales at places like was it Select Tech down in Miami? They've had solar panels with minor blemishes but still full output, for like 75 cents a watt. Well, that's crazy cheap. You can't run a car on it, although you could charge a car in a couple of days of sunlight. But compared to the return from putting money into paper, it certainly makes a lot of sense to me to invest in those basics like solar panels and seeds and move toward personal self-sufficiency as best you can, regardless of whether you happen to be, condo farming. When I say condo farming, I mean, you have a deck in a condo and you grow tomatoes outside, or whether you've got a regular size city house and put a garden in and actually spend some time gardening when you're not working. Those are the kinds of things that really make sense. I haven't backed away from my personal self-sufficiency objective, I don't think at all. I just don't think that it's a popular way of looking at things because it's a hell of a lot more work and it's not nearly as much fun as watching Idol on TV or something.
Yeah.
The food's better too.
Yes. So what do you think about the truckers with the cost of oil?
I don't think that's ever going to go away. I don't think that truckers get to the point where they park all the rigs and we all starve to death. That ain't going to happen.
Okay.
What is going to happen, what will happen instead, is the price will go up. And that, again, we're back to, okay, so if you have some heritage seeds and you've got some, I'm sitting here in my office, I've got a couple of cans of, hermetically sealed cans of, let me see what these are. This one is a fall garden. And over here, this is 2 pounds of organic alfalfa seeds, 8 ounces of organic broccoli, 8 ounces of organic radish. We're talking seeds here. Just this one, the alfalfa seeds, is approximately 532,000 plants worth, depending on germination rate. They're big cans.
Wow.
I'm lucky. I've got room to plant this stuff. And I can go down to the local feed store and I can buy, 50-pound sack of rye seeds. And by next spring, I'll have the happiest, fattest deer in the world. And it will, depending on what you put into your soil, you can actually improve the soil on a piece of property depending on what you plant. Like putting beans in or peanuts and things like that, you can actually fix nitrogen back in the soil. So it's a whole different skill set, and it's not nearly as much fun as texting, the hot member of the opposite sex. But if you're a young person and you want to continue eating for the next 40 years, then things like the SAS Survival Handbook and the different field books on how to forage for plants and so forth, seems to me that we're in a period where we've got 7 billion people trying to turn into 8 billion people, and we've got limited resource, and we know prices are going to go up. So your choice is you either grow your own local or you are held as a victim to wherever the price goes based on limited resource. And it doesn't seem to be a real hard choice to me to at least begin doing some hobby farming while it's still possible. I'm sure everybody remembers, the people in Iraq were forced to buy American seeds, and they were explicitly told, no, you can't just grow anything you want anymore. Well, that's the part of the world that's broken. That's the part of suppressing human potential. People forget that, corn started off as plain old grass, and it was just bred over, centuries by earlier peoples who figured out that they could build bigger and bigger grass seeds. And as those seed pods were bred bigger and bigger, today we have corn and we don't think anything about it. Yet most corn is certainly not original, naturally occurring stuff. it's a slow process of human invention and working in concert with nature rather than working out of phase with it.
Yeah, I've been doing my learning curve with my garden, and I think making mistakes is the best thing to be doing right now because then you learn. But my next question is kind of about crops in the U.S. Because recently they said there was a bumper crop projections of U.S. harvests, but then, kind of reality came in when the crops are coming in that have been affected by droughts and floods, and grain seems to be particularly hard hit. And I'm hearing about cattle farmers feeding wheat because they can't get or afford corn. I think there's mandates that gasoline in most states must be part ethanol, which is made from corn. And also considering that corn or corn syrup is in most American foods, how do you see this playing out?
Don't get me started on HFCS. You know what that is, right? High fructose corn syrup.
Oh, yeah.
Poison. Now, I know somebody's going to call up or write in and go, you're as an idiot because he doesn't like high fructose corn syrup. Well, some people like me are extraordinarily sensitive, allergy-wise, to things that don't spin the right direction. And high fructose corn syrup, I get allergic reactions to because I'm allergic to some kinds of corn. And I've actually had to go to the hospital back when some Starlink leaked into the public food supplies. This was, oh gosh, I want to say 10 years ago. But that stuff, anything that's genetically modified is dangerous as hell. As for the prices, part of the price in commodities right now is unpredictable because we're still seeing the effects of MF Global's debacle. We don't know how much of that trading was done by legitimate manufacturers of foodstuffs who were simply trying to hedge future supply prices for their products, or how much of that was because of Chinese coming in and and they'll do this, every year. They'll come in and buy huge quantities of rice and corn and so forth. And remember the part earlier where I was saying we need to kick all lobbyists of any kind out of Washington, take their checkbooks away, burn their checkbooks, disband their organizations, and go back to being a people-driven government instead of a checkbook government. That's where your methanol is coming from. Methanol out here in ranching country is not well thought of. And the reason it's not is some equipment on a ranch, you only use 3 or 4 months out of the year. Like, this is chainsaw season for us because it's the time of the year when trees blow over. And every frigging year, I end up taking my Husqvarna 455 Rancher to my local Husqvarna 455 Rancher repair shop where the carburetor gets torn apart. It gets cleaned out because the methanol turns to varnish in only 3 or 4 months. It becomes significantly more difficult to burn. Now, this year I'm getting ahead of the problem, having gotten back into flying. I'll simply go stock up a large drum of 100 octane low lead avgas, which will burn just fine in my farm machinery. And I won't have to worry about it turning to varnish quite so fast. And I can get some gas stabilizer, Stable makes one and a few others, and you can actually increase the shelf life of it. So in terms of looking at crops, yeah, crops are kind of like unemployment reports. They may sound good for the market, but what you see when you read the fine print is you'll see, crops came in at 102% of whatever compared with last year. But if you read the footnotes, you see only 95% of the acreage was planted this year. So one figure for the public is crop production is great. And the reality is there's less bushels of stuff coming in, but it's the same kind of reporting methodology the Soviets managed to pioneer in making things look good while people were starving.
Thank you.
Thank you, Green Meadow, and thank you, George. We are speaking with George Ure. Please help support him by visiting his website, urbansurvival.com, and consider becoming a subscriber to peoplenomics.com. I can tell you from personal experience, it's well worth the small subscription fee. George, I first learned of you back at the University of Colorado boards, and back then, at that time, there was a lot of discussion in regard to the Kondratiev wave. Some aspects of debt deflation, a key component of the Kondratiev cycle, have been popping up, from bad debts associated with bad mortgages and other loans to potentially now bad sovereign debt. Yet the debt as money system continues to try to prop up the collapsing Ponzi scheme. From your assessment, where are we in the long count? And while hopefully most listening know about this, perhaps you could very briefly describe that as well.
Me very briefly describing anything
Okay.
could cause a new religion to be formed.
Let's let them go off and Wikipedia the Kondratiev cycle for themselves.
Well, let me give it to you the short version, because it really is very much on point. The Kondratiev wave was a series of observations made by a fellow by the name of Nicholas Kondratiev, who looked at prices of grains. In fact, I've got one of his publications here, article from the Review of Economic Statistics, volume 17, number 6 of November 1935, pages 105 to 115. How about that? What he did is he looked, well, here's a chart that he did of coal production and consumption from 1830 to 1910. Elsewhere, he goes back and looks at index numbers of commodity prices that he reconstructed from 1780 through 1920, and a lot of other nice, neat charts like that. And what the dude notices is over a fairly regular period of 48 to 64 years, prices regularly spike and then regularly decline, such that from heartbeat to heartbeat, if you will, is this roughly 50-year period. The Kondratiev cycle suggests that, at least in earlier economic history, things like the biblical Jubilee year, where all debts are forgiven, had some pretty good basis in fact, and that if you want more, you can read the book of Leviticus, although the money changers who have taken over the church may not like the idea of giving up interest. So I guess that's one of those ongoing themes, if you will, across great spans of history, is that there's always money changers around, and they may not always have the best interest of purer spirits at heart. How's that for subtle?
It's on mark.
So fast forward, Kondratiev predicted to Joseph Stalin, for whom he worked, in the mid-1920s, that the U.S. was going to have the worst depression the world had ever seen, and Stalin was thrilled with that. And then Kondratiev said, but did I tell you they'll be back bigger and stronger than ever? And sure enough, we did. And for thinking that way and daring to say it to Joe the Butcher, Kondratiev was sent off to a labor camp in Siberia. The reason that you ran across me and folks like Howard Hill and Steve Swaim and Tom Drake and a bunch of others in the 1990s discussing Kondratiev long wave theory was that something is wrong with the long wave here recently. It should have collapsed into a second depression in 1987 or so, which would be roughly 50 years after the 1929 event. Or it should have collapsed with the economic stagnation period of the 1990s, which was addressed by starting up Gulf War One, and then it should have arrived when the internet bubble blew up following the year 2000, and we sank into the really the very edge of global depression in late 2001, but almost too conveniently from an economics perspective, that tipping point into the Great Depression at the roughly 70-year mark was again avoided because we had a war on terror breakout. And I've argued that the spending that we have done on the war on terror, the Middle East, and our adventures in Afghanistan, Iraq, our wild fascination with domestic security has really had a very salutary effect in that it has caused there to be massive government hiring, and that has provided an economic stimulus which has prevented a Kondratiev long wave from appearing. And the Kondratiev long wave, of course, is built into 4 seasons: spring, summer, winter, fall. And so if we look at the period after World War II and the first part of the Korean conflict, we saw there the beginning of the Kondratiev spring. And we saw rapid yet sustainable growth and massive industrial development and so forth, the development of the consumer economy and what have you. Now, as we move forward, the Kondratiev summer was likely the 1980s shading into the 90s, although it didn't seem like it at the time. We're now at the juncture between Kondratiev fall and the Kondratiev winter. One of the characteristics of these long waves in the economy is you tend to get major wars at the bottom of those troughs. So, in other words, the trough war associated with the Great Depression was World War II. There was not really enough sustainable economic activity at the depths of the Great Depression. And so what better way to create economic prosperity than go around and kill people and break things? Similarly, when you have too much prosperity and too much in the way of resource, too many young people, the way you end that part of the Kondratiev wave in the summer is by having a peak war. And 1962, I think it was, when Kennedy had the first advisors in to Southeast Asia, the whole Vietnam experience on up through 73, 74, that 10 years war, stated or otherwise, really qualifies as the long wave peak war. And it was also concurrent with the peak of the Third World War, which is in the history books widely read as the Cold War. But that really was a peak war for all intents and purposes. So now we're in the fall shading into winter. And normally at this period of time, we would be expecting things like massive deflation, which is really out there if you know where to look for it. And we'd be setting up for another war, which will ultimately, in a few years, or I hope Cliff's data doesn't say this, but could actually happen as early as next year, which would kill people and break things sufficiently so that we would have new industries arising out of things like coping with radiation while still living in America, or coping with radiation while raising food. But those are the kinds of technologies and advances that we can expect from the next World War, which should logically be along as soon as we put in a good Kondratiev winter bottom. Now there is a little bit of a problem in that the Kondratiev winter bottom is hard to define by looking at traditional economic indicators because it's a widely recognized cycle. And as such, guys like Ben Bernanke, who are very well read on the Depression, understand that the thing you need to do in a deflationary period is print money like crazy. And so one can easily see how the U.S. Federal Reserve would likely be inclined to hold on just one second. Federal Reserve gov. You can actually look up the rate at which the Federal Reserve has been promoting money creation in order to paper over what in the Depression would have been the really, really horrific deflationary period where cash becomes king. So when we look at the current 12-month rate of M1 creation, what we find is it's going up by 20.8%. And if we zoom in just on the most recent 3-month reporting period, we'll see that the M1 rate is increasing at 29.2%. And the broader M2 cash and money creation number is running at 13.3%. That's for 3 months annualized. So the thinking of the Fed is right. I don't have any quarrel with how they're proceeding, except for this. They haven't come out and been candid with the American people about where we are in the long wave economic cycle. Now, obviously, economists are mainly those who are schooled in formulas. And because they're schooled in formulas, they don't like to admit cycles even exist. They like to think of everything as neat interlocked formulas that can tell you anything you want to know. But if you step back from the chart of the Dow or step back from any of the commodity charts, you'll see that there are regular price fluctuations over time. And especially they become evident when you back out the underlying rate of inflation, the so-called CPI deflator. So that's how Kondratiev is. As I say, we're either in or approaching winter. That's good. Unfortunately, Kondratiev winters end with world wars or other calamities. The U.S. Civil War happened approximately 60 years before the Great Depression. So that was our trough war of the 1850-60 period. World War II was our trough war, ending the last Kondratiev winter. The one that's just ahead of us, 2014-2015, may very well be Chinese or it could be Russian. It just depends on how things pencil out in coming months. But we should see. Gosh, I don't want to say should see, but it's statistically big wars happen in these periods, and so golden mushrooms going off someplace in the world. Maybe it's India, Pakistan. Maybe it's Iran and spreading from that, or maybe it's the U.S. trying to interfere in Russian internal politics in their elections. I don't know what the Archduke Ferdinand equivalent will be. By the way, World War I was a peak war. We'll see that kind of scale of global violence likely.
Yep, it's a sad set of circumstances that we do go through these cycles, but it seems to be that's the way and how humanity tends to bring things about. And you get from one cycle of overexpansion through a contractionary period, albeit tending to be in a violent mode, and shifting back into the opportunity to reestablish growth.
Well, yeah, and the other thing that people don't realize is the tremendous amount of technical innovation that comes from periods of war. I'll give you an example. Suppose that you and I were to invent an anti-gravity machine today. That'd be pretty slick, right? I'd put one on my airplane, and oh boy, could I ever impress the air traffic control center, right? Uh, you know, Musketeer 12 Lima request immediate clearance to 12,000 feet. And the tower is used to an airplane that, or the controllers are used to an airplane that on a really good day down low will climb 500 feet a minute. But I mean, if you had something like that that could pop up to, 10, 12,000 feet in a few seconds, that would be a game changer. The problem is that such game changers cause massive, and see, when people envision the future, they don't really wrap their heads around it correctly, because they go, oh golly, wouldn't it be great to have that car from Back to the Future, fly, travel through time. Yes and no. The no, unfortunately, is that you can collapse an economy overnight with what our friends at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, call disruptive technologies. If you and I were to invent this gravity pod that we could stick on the old Dodge pickup truck out here on the ranch, or on your Audi R8 or whatever you're driving, you wish, right?
Yeah.
What would happen to Boeing? Well, Boeing would be, their stock would be down the crapper in no time. And it wouldn't just be American Airlines that would be declaring bankruptcy. Every airline would be declaring bankruptcy, because the technology is currently, remember the days of client server architecture discussions?
Ooh, how?
Yeah, that hurts, right? And yet we're back there. We've evolved back to that with cloud computing. I mean, when you think about it, globally, Google's strategy seems to be a variant of client server architecture. They're putting the software, like their Chrome browser, out on the client, and the server tends to be the cloud, and so they're storing Google Docs and Google spreadsheets and AdWords and everything else is in the cloud. So it just depends on who's positioned how to take advantage of what kind of architecture that comes along. And that's what makes this such an interesting thing. I mean, I can hardly wait to get up every morning, come out to my office, and see what the moving pieces are, and whether the marbles are rolling toward the trough war being between the U.S. and Russia. Most people don't realize, my consigliere pointed this out to me this past Thursday. He said, you do know historically why China and the U.S. are so close right now. And he reminded me that in 1971 or 2, Russia was threatening to use nuclear weapons in a preemptive manner against the Chinese nuclear development site out in the desert at Lop Nor. And Richard Nixon, for all of his conniving character problems, really understood, and as did Henry Kissinger, the importance to the United States of China, and told Russia that we would go to war with China just as though it were a U.S. state being attacked. And that was the second near brush with global disaster following the Cuban Missile Crisis. Most people don't know, or I don't think fully appreciate, how close we became, or how close we came in that period, 71, 72, to a global war with Russia. And as a result, when Nixon and Kissinger were invited to China, I think that was 73 or so, it wasn't because we were such nice people. It was because we had basically ensured then communist China's independence. And that was our payoff, is getting big name American companies rights to build, distribute, manufacture in China, and then being able to take advantage of the low prevailing labor rate and outsource expensive American manufacturing to China.
Okay, great. Thanks, George. Our next question will come from Romans, who is posing a question on behalf of Futurama.
Hi, George.
Hi.
I have a question here from one of my favorite forum members, Futurama. Kind of deals with what you've been talking about. He says, one economic factor I consider urgently important and which is virtually unspoken of in the media is the effect on our economy of the massive destruction of asset values that has occurred over the past 5 years or so. For example, asset values of residential real estate, commercial real estate, stocks, bonds, business values, bankruptcies, etc. According to the research that Futurama has done, there has been more destruction of assets throughout the economy over that time frame than there has been Fed money creation. So, if there is $5 trillion less dollars worth of value on the balance sheets of all Americans combined today than there was 5 years ago, doesn't that point more in the direction of deflation? And then I'll have a follow-up.
The short answer is it would seem to. But remember what I was getting to a moment ago, looking at the Fed's money creation rate. It depends on how you want to measure deflation. So yes, I'll grant you that the average American home, even today, is worth between 20 and 30% less than it was worth in 2007. So yes, that represents an asset that has dropped dramatically. However, because the Federal Reserve has been creating money, and most recently creating M1 at almost 30% per year, if you match the creation of money with the rate of incipient deflation, the effects of what would normally be a horrific deflation can be pretty much moderated. That's what the Fed, I think, is trying to do. I think they're trying to keep liquidity in the system. And even the still bailing out Europe with looser funding for the central banks. Even if Europe goes through a partial disintegration, whatever the cost of that is, it's thought that Europe will be able to come back and remain competitive in the world marketplace and eventually pay back some of whatever the cost of bailing them out is. That's the economic fairy tale. The reality of it is that there has been asset deflation. I have an indicator I use which I call the aggregate index, and it's a much harsher view of the stock market than a simple measure like the S&P or the Dow Jones Industrials, because it includes the NASDAQ composite. And so if we look at the total wealth holdings of Americans on an inflation-adjusted basis, the real peak of the U.S. economy happened in about 2000, concurrent with the internet bubble peak. Where it goes from here, unfortunately, is down, and it will probably go down for at least another 5 years or longer, which would put us out in the 2017, 2018 kind of area. And that's when a lot of economists are looking for a real turnaround in the future of the world. A friend, Dr. Jack Lessinger, who's a professor emeritus of business history at the University of Washington, semi-retired up in the Bellingham area, has a wonderful book called Transformation. and it describes a kind of purified capitalism where the role of capital drifts. It becomes a little more socially conscious than it is presently, and it turns into something which actually is very good. Unfortunately, it's the part between here and 2020 that will be problematic, in particular if we have a war, which would simply hasten the asset destruction. Remember that asset destruction is one of the common features of economic depressions. Assets get wiped off the table all the time. Unfortunately, except for a few of us who've been out there pointing this out at the top of our lungs on the internet, most of the mainstream media has not had any particular reason to be candid with people about the end of 30 years of inflation that began in the 60s. And when that period of systemic inflation came to an end and we began our long slide down, the financial press not been especially good at bringing alternatives available to little people into clear focus. And part of that, unfortunately, is because of how advertising is so tightly tied to media. There ain't no money to be made, at least in any great measure, by taking by buying something like gold or even bonds, and yet bonds have turned out in the last few years to have performed very well compared to traditional levered inflation investments. And so, yeah, it ain't over yet. Your friend's probably right. Whether it's 5 trillion or 10 trillion doesn't really matter, because we're in a world where there's 250 trillion in swaps, credit derivatives, and what have yous. So the only number that really matters is how much money you've got in your bank account tomorrow to buy food with.
Right. The follow-up question, George, which you kind of alluded to a little bit, was he'd like to have your opinion as to why this factor is being totally ignored by the mainstream media, and whether or not you've integrated that component into your expectations as to what you anticipate in the future.
Yeah, I think I've anticipated it in my own personal plan. I am not a financial advisor. I'm a sales and marketing guy that solves problems for companies that don't understand sales processes and how to streamline them. That's what I really do. The fact that urban survival and peoplenomics kind of got legs under them and became runaway little success stories while I'm trying to figure out strategies for companies is kind of interesting. But the reason that the mainstream media isn't covering this stuff is because, first, media doesn't make the news. Unfortunately, they usually are in the position of reporting the news, and so because the media, especially the mainstream financial press, does not ask questions that are look ahead in value very well, and when they do, they tend to present extremes, which may or may not be correct. You can see some very, very good look-ahead journalism, by the way, when you look at guys like Dr. Doom, Dr. Mark Faber, being interviewed on CNBC, or Meredith Whitney, who's a superb bank analyst. And although she is sometimes early, she is usually right in the longer term. So the problem is not that the financial press totally ignores the look ahead stuff. The problem is that the financial press, uh, because it's easier to package, I guess, um, focuses on what I think of as idiot level economic stories. 10 ways to save money for your kid to go to college, or 13 ways to get rich returning pop bottles, or crap like that. It's more of that bullshit filler stuff. And the real problem is we're in a country that's been hijacked by lobbyists and a banker class, and we've got to figure out how to get our jobs back, how to get factory ownership back into America, how to onshore the tax base such that transnationals are not hiding all their money offshore beyond U.S. tax jurisdictions, and so forth. So, yeah, we can quibble about all the little stuff, but the fact of the matter is that there aren't too many people in politics, with the exception of maybe Ron Paul and a couple of others, who are willing to stand up to the check beast and say, this ain't right. We have principles. Instead, we don't have principles. We have campaign contributions.
Right. Right. Yeah. And Meredith Whitney, she was way early on that municipal call, but I think she'll be right in the end.
Yeah. I mean, and we're seeing the slow degradation. See what happened in the 1930s. Just to drop back to the 30s for a sec. The reason that depression came on so fast was that the little ma and pa banks, down at the corner, they didn't have the money. I mean, when there was a run on banks in the 30s, if you went down to the bank and it shut its doors, you were screwed and you took the loss right there. And so when you took that loss immediately, you could not make your house payment. And so immediately, whoever held that mortgage came and foreclosed. And so things went very rapidly. But in this depression, the reason that people do not see it as a depression, and they don't see it as the class struggle it is between capital and the rest of us without it, is that it's happening in slow motion. When a bank closes, and we've had over 6,000 bank branches, 6,000 bank branches, including 17 more just this week at a little bank down in Louisiana. I think it was 3 or 4 at another bank. So about 20 bank branches this week alone were closed out or shotgun married off by FDIC. We haven't had a big WAMU or an IndyMac sized one happen in a little while, but that doesn't mean we won't. But if you look at what's going on in banking right now, in almost none of those cases did individual depositors suffer an immediate house losing kind of financial impact. FDIC, to their credit, regardless of whether they printed the money up or not, doesn't really matter. To their credit, it has slowed down the snowball. We've got a big snowball, and the biggest snowball right now is in Europe. And from a long wave economic perspective, excuse me, one of the hardest problems is, why are we taking 75 years or 85 years to run through an economic cycle, which previously took only 50 years? What is it? Several things come to mind. First, regulatory reform. FDIC has ensured that bank losses are not immediately felt by depositors. It'll be stretched out over a number of years. There will be FDIC expenses built into banking costs. But for now, FDIC is hanging together, and it's preventing people from losing their retirement money that's in the bank. The second thing that is taking place and is different than the last depression is the speed at which people are being kicked out of their homes. Even though not enough people have taken advantage of the various federal refinancing programs, we still can see that compared with how fast foreclosures began ramping up in the 1930s, we're seeing a slower rate of foreclosure, and we're seeing a lot of banks go to some extraordinary efforts in order to keep loans in the performing loan category so that they don't have to admit to how bad things really are. Another factor, of course, is that this all may relate to something we call the debt berg, which is basically the number of years that you can keep watering down a currency before it essentially falls to nothing. In 1919, the U.S. dollar would buy you a lot more than it does today. In fact, it would buy you almost 40 times more than it will buy you today in the way of purchasing power. But it's not that the cost of a steak dinner as an intrinsic value has changed. I mean, steak and potato in 1919 is the same as a steak and potato of today.
Right.
But what's changed is we've simply printed up somewhere between 20 and 100 times. We could argue how much money's been created, but we've printed up so much money that the price seems to go up. But it's not that prices go up. You see, this is part of the big myth. Prices do not go up. The value, the intrinsic purchasing power of your money goes down. So if I had $1, the most I can ever pay for a steak dinner is $1. Well, that's 1919. Today I've got $30 in my pocket. So hey, guess how much a steak dinner is going to be? And it's that way with tuition. It's that way with housing, and you see how that works.
Yep, that's creeping inflation.
Well, and it's really started at the Fed, and I'm not going to bankster bash, although it's pretty easy to do. But they have a figure that's reported monthly called the Consumer Credit Report. Well, it's not credit, it's debt. It's how fast are people putting their head in the debt noose. But they don't call it debt, because if they called it debt, people go, oh crap, I don't want to have any of that. So instead they go, oh, it's consumer credit. Yeah, I just got another credit card. In the interest of disclosure, why couldn't the banksters have called it a debt card?
Good point.
And why do they call it bankruptcy reform? No, it's bankruptcy punishment. It isn't reform. Reform my butt. It's punishment. You can't get out from a student loan anymore, even if there's no job there. The government comes out with a report every year called the Occupational Outlook from the Department of Labor, and if you're going to go spend 40 grand on an education, one of your trusted sources that every vocational counselor in the world and every education counselor in the world looks at is this Occupational Outlook. Crap, they're still looking at growth for construction management supervisors, for God's sake. It's like, hello, I think we have enough. What we need are some people in government at I don't want to say a super committee level, but Congress would be a good starting point to direct federal agencies to get their head out of the sand and start looking at real-time numbers and more accurate look-ahead numbers, because the last time I looked, they're still looking for major construction growth in the United States in the coming 5-year period. Now, I'm not sure, but most places have a lot of vacant housing. I'm not sure, but when my wife and I were up in Detroit this summer for the National Society of Newspaper Columnists, I happen to be a member of that group, good group. We were up in Detroit, and we got the tour of the Quicken Loan command center and so forth. Very heads up companies in Detroit. But right next door are empty friggin' buildings. And now you saw this week Detroit's going to try a city lottery to prop their shit up.
Yeah.
It's like, what the hell? But we are all living in a financial Disneyland right now. And we're supposed to hold to the idea that this is how reality really operates. And I'm sorry, but Uncle George is a little concerned. So I just sit out here and keep consulting clients and keep to myself. But if somebody wants to go read Urban Survival or Peoplenomics, well, then that's one more educated person who may be inclined to ask harder questions of the idiots running for office, some 90 of which this week proved they were anti-Constitution, anti-America by saying it's okay for the military to arrest Americans. No, that's the job of local law enforcement if they're on American soil. I mean, even during the Democratic Convention, the National Guard was called in, sure, but they handed the people over to the local authorities for prosecution and trial. That's going away. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a little bit of a concern because that's when words like fascism come out. And yes, I understand. In fact, I wrote about it in Peoplenomics this morning. The problem with MF Global. Oh my God, what a can of worms that is. And yet, no one has been arrested. Why? Members of the club, the good old boys. They're plugged in. I mean, yeah, Corzine's been subpoenaed by Congress, but I'll have to call him this week and ask. But I'm wondering if Gerald Celente ever got his gold investments returned to him.
I doubt it.
And if he did, is it only because of his position as a squeaky wheel? What about the widow and orphan types who don't have any public forum and no horsepower? I mean, see, that's what's wrong. That's the injustice stuff we've got to solve. And the kind of change we've had so far has not been appropriate.
Right. I agree. We've got to have laws that can be enforced and everybody be held to the law. Well, thank you, George.
Hallelujah. I'm voting for you.
You've really given us a lot to think about, and I appreciate it.
And thank you very much, Romans. This kind of leads us into another area that will probably tie up a fair amount of time, but we'd really like to get your input on it, George. To me, at least, it seems that the fundamental and key components of trust with a capital T, in government, in money, systems, and institutions that have worked in the past are breaking down, and that the world's populace are waking up to the realization that they have been lied to, screwed over, and are in need of change. And what that change is and how it should or could initiate is open for debate and runs contrary to the established vested interests. This obviously is showing up in the North African upheaval, the riots and demonstrations in Europe, the Occupy movement, the Japanese citizenry's distrust of their government in the wake of the Fukushima disaster, etc. This is clearly running against the powers that be's goals and aspirations. Aside from Webbot predictions, how do you see this playing out over the next 3 to 6 to 12 months?
Depends on how the economy plays. We can almost make a Boolean table out of it. If this happens, then this happens. If that happens, then something else happens over here. If the economy collapses and it is because of endogenous or systemic internal causes, then things are going to get truly, truly ugly. Occupy Wall Street will turn into an even bigger deal and possibly higher levels of violence. My expectation, though, just based on, and this is only a couple of conversations, and I haven't read the upcoming bot report, but I have a sense of at least some of the things that may be in it. I think we all stand to be mightily surprised by the off the charts kind of outliers external to markets, external to everybody's plans for how they're going to go about keeping the country together. Picture, if you will, a situation where, millions of people find that their retirements will not buy them anywhere near the kind of lifestyle that they presently have. And so they're going to stay in the workforce, and that's going to keep young people from finding jobs. And so more and more young people are going to hit the streets and start demonstrating. You're going to have clashes between young and old over employment, healthcare rationing, and let's not forget the 3% or whatever sales tax on home sales that's coming as part of the healthcare bill at the end of 2012. But you'll notice not till after the elections, and the political parties at the trough will do everything they can to avoid that kind of thing. So if we have that, then we have one kind of ugly future with fighting in the street kind of scenarios. But suppose something else happens. Suppose the Pacific plate cracks and we get major tsunami activity, and that takes out much of the manufacturing around the Pacific Rim. And let's further suppose that this chain of mega quakes causes destruction of the Three Gorges Dam in China and kills 100 million people with flooding. And at the same time, New Madrid pops off, and we lose 30,000 dead, but virtually all infrastructure is ruined in an area basically from Mississippi through the upper Michigan Peninsula. So I guess what I'm saying is there's enough wild card stuff like that until I get a chance to read the report when it comes out and see, what final draft and how the space goat fart entity and all the other stuff looks, I think I'd be a fool to venture guesses as to how it all plays out. Of course, I am a fool, and you did ask.
I don't think you're a fool in any way, George. Like you, I hold an advanced degree, that MBA designation, and I will spin my own different sets of scenarios and Boolean tables and decision trees out into all kinds of different directions that'll go in a wide variety of different directions. And
exactly.
A lot of it is contextual and evolving, especially in these days today. For our last question, we're going to toss this one over to Ellery. Ellery?
Thank you. The question is, how soon do you think Europe will explode? When it does, what do you think it will do to the precious metal prices?
Precious metal prices, oh boy, short term or long term? See, there's this moving lever thing. It's a clockwork or a key. You put one key in and you twist it, and then this other key needs to twist this way, and that key over there twists that way. So very short term, if Europe is to go, I don't expect it will really go until the massive release language period in the report, which would probably be, Europe falling apart may be the kind of thing that triggers the worldwide depression becoming obvious in your face March through all of 2012 and into 2013. And then while we're trying to clean up from that, then maybe we get Space Goat Farts comes in with, I think Ed Dames calls it kill shot from the sun, and that's how life works out. And that, of course, becomes pretty ugly pretty quick. So, I mean, if I had to throw a dart, I'd say Yeah, right down March 9th for the beginning of the definitive end of the euro. But already, Cliff has mentioned some folks he knows that, because he comes from the heavy duty computer world, who are already working on the code so that banks can operate either euro or whatever their local currency is. And in particular, the place which is moving most aggressively on that is Germany. Um, so, like I say, I expect the Dow to end the year at 12,450. I expect January will end at 10,000. February and March will pop back up to 11.5 maybe. And then from March through November of next year, the Dow goes down to 1600. That's my opinion. And I've, my personal portfolio is down about 25% for the year so far. And it could go down even further as the market goes up here in coming weeks. But when we start turning around, I'm not particularly worried about losing a couple of $1,000s on paper, because it's not a loss until I cash in my chit, and that's CHIT, not the other one. But more important, there's this 25 to 50% downside potential, which could easily put me back over the 80% gain where my portfolio was at mid-year, because I called that one right. But money comes and goes, and people come and go, and circumstances change on an hourly basis. And as I noted on the Urban Survival site Friday, nobody is safe, and nobody should ever bet against the Fed, because as long as there is a printing option in Europe, in the United States, or among any of the central banks, there will be compelling reasons for the bankers to simply paper over the crisis. And then all that remains is for the economic dislocations to propagate to the point where a broad enough section of humans recognize that they have been lewd, crude, and screwed. And that's when the collapse takes place. It doesn't have to relate to, like, Greece repudiating, whichever bond, or Italy refusing to pay interest on whatever IMF loan, or Spain not being able to pay for something. It's likely not to be like that. It'll likely, those will be factors. Those will be like the picket fences on the road to hell going by. But the wall that we run into at the end of it is when humans globally rise up and say, bullshit, we're not putting up with any more. We want massive, massive change in the whole paradigm to something that will work going forward. And the problem is that it's right at that moment of public awareness arising that we saw in the case of 2001, the almost magical appearance of a context changer. The context changer being the so-called terrorist, which led us into Iraq, even though nobody seemed to be connected with Iraq. They were all really connected with Saudi Arabia. So would that be the point, March of next year, when in lieu of public recognition, war breaks out at some major superpower level? Maybe, because nothing will cover the tracks of the evildoers, and nothing will ensure their fake stardom in the history books better than a massive war, which will wipe out all the evidence of the crimes. And if it happens to be war involving electromagnetic pulse weapons in the upper atmosphere that destroy computer infrastructure, oh shit, sorry about that. So we have no banking records. Oh well. And that's the kind of crap we're talking about. And then, of course, all that needs to occur is because the military is now in process of being handed control, a commander in chief can kind of run the country as, and I'm sure they'll position it as a benevolent dictatorship, uh, and try to get the country through. Um, but whether or not the public is willing to buy that, especially given the lack of substantive change in a humanistic direction we've seen so far over the last, well, the period since the war on terror began, whether people will continue granting more time or will simply take it to the street, um, becomes an interesting area of speculation, in particular because there are something like 8 guns for every American. And we could be in a bloody civil mess. And as soon as it begins to move that way, we'll have the breakdown of supportive infrastructure, including but not limited to water, garbage collection, food distribution, farming, manufacturing, electricity. The internet goes away, and we're all the F word.
Okay, wow. It's been quite an interesting time that we've spent here with you, George.
Hey,
Um,
anytime I can brighten up your life, just even as bad as those prospects are, uh, it's still okay to be an optimist. I am an optimist because I think we can muddle through without those worst cases. If we can't, I'm 63. I'm a useless eater, except for the fact that I provide some economic value. And if I got to go away, I'm going to go away someday anyway. What the hell? Cliff and I had lunch, and we were talking here last week. Yeah, last week, or was it the week before? Anyway, we were talking over lunch, and Cliff's got an interesting twinkle in his eye that didn't used to be there. And I asked him about it, and it's we've both been, I won't want to say dark, foreboding, bummed out, bummer kind of people. But we have been a little bit dark, foreboding, and bummer kind of people, especially because the linguistic project, while not perfect by any sense, it still has given us a peek at the future at a little above chance on some of these things, as most of your listeners and readers know. Um, but I think the glint that is in Cliff's eye is that the moment of decisive engagement, to use a military term, is upon us, and it will likely be a time when humans, for better or for worse, are going to demonstrate conclusively whether or not we're grown-ups who can actually live together, work together, play together, share values, and move forward, or whether we are a bunch of you-know-what tards who really do deserve to live under the lash of money changers who will continue to dominate politics and secular life and every other thing we touch, including controlling our food supplies, for perhaps a couple of 100 years into the future. So to say that we're optimistic maybe isn't the right word, but I think we're both very pleased that within the next 2 years, the world is going to become a radically better place to live. And the great news is that we're all alive at this time and can put our shoulder to the wheel of doing what's right. And our guiding documents, at least in my case, include the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and some of those founding cornerstones of America. I don't think we can go wrong with those. The question is whether they'll be seized from us to keep us from pursuing those ends.
Well, we certainly hope that things will show up the best for omni-humanity, because that's truly in all of our interests, and we do need to get our world back from the bankers.
Amen.
We've been speaking with George Ewer of Urban Survival. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us and sharing your thoughts today, George. We hope listeners have gained insights into the topics we've been discussing, and we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. If you didn't, you must not have paid attention to our no refunds, no exchanges policy, where we clearly state that all sales are final. Since we are the Time Monk Radio Network, we are forward looking and we believe that the past is for historians as long as its lessons have been learned. On behalf of Fox, and all of the members of Time Monk Radio, thank you, George. And in our tradition, may you and yours have many tasty pies to come.
Many pies to you, and peace out.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thanks, George.
Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, George.
How was that?